Good morning.
To see you again. How are you?
Good morning.
It is still morning, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Martin, Senator Marcelino, Senator Boyle. Well, it's been mentioned here this morning already. What we've been experiencing the past 5 years and what our local governments and state have been experiencing is actually something new and unprecedented in the post-World War II era, which is a prolonged period of sluggish economic growth, coupled with a pronounced disinflationary tendency, so that revenues not only plummeted, they have barely recovered to where they were. But it's important to recognize the recession, or the so-called Great Recession, did not cause the problems now faced by many counties, municipalities, and school districts. Rather, the recession exposed a fundamental structural imbalance in our state and local budgets that had been geared to run on average annual revenue increases that were unsustainable in the long run. An important point to make, and not to be forgotten, I think, is that the largest single component of local budgets, indeed typically 2/3 or more of municipal spending in particular, and a somewhat higher percentage of school district spending, is employee compensation. Local government is a people business on both sides. And in New York, the wages and salaries of employees and their benefits are driven by inflexible collective bargaining agreements essentially locked into place under the Taylor Law. Now, the crucial question for the legislature to consider here is whether there is a state interest in preventing local governments from drifting into insolvency. In New York, the answer, up until now at least, has always been yes. The framework for heading off municipal bankruptcy in New York since the mid-1970s has been to create a financial bailout vehicle coupled with a state control board to oversee local finances, and this has been put into effect a half dozen times since the New York City fiscal crisis, including twice in the case of Yonkers. Now, no one would claim that control boards are a cure-all, although I would agree with some previous speakers who pointed out that they've been an effective way to at least temporarily restore stability and to forestall much more serious financial problems in places where local leaders and other stakeholders have been unwilling or unable to voluntarily make the decisions that need to be made to restore those attributes to the system. But control boards are no substitute for permanent fundamental structural reform. The problem is that existing state laws, including but not limited to the Taylor Law, make such structural reforms very difficult to accomplish. If you're looking for a more effective alternative to the financial control board model, here it is. Give local officials more tools to fix their own problems and then get out of their way. That would mean embracing, not ignoring, needed Taylor Law reforms, such as repeal of the Triborough Amendment. Parenthetically, I'd like to add, by the way, and I've heard some of this today, few issues in state law are as poorly and widely poorly misunderstood as the Triborough Amendment. In the early 70s, the Public Employee Relations Board, through an arbitration agreement or mediation, established something called the Triborough Doctrine. The Triborough Doctrine, which has the force of law, protects and locks in place all so-called mandatory items of negotiation after a contract has expired. Mandatory items of negotiation include pay, benefits, and work schedules. The Triborough Amendment, which was enacted in 1982, goes beyond that to lock in non-mandatory items, the principal one being step increments, step pay increments. If you repeal the Triborough Amendment, you are not repealing the Triborough Doctrine. If you repeal the Triborough Amendment, you are not leaving unions bereft of all protection and at the mercy of employers who can completely eradicate their benefits or salaries. That's not true. So I would urge you to keep that in mind. Giving local officials more tools to fix their own problems would also mean overturning PERB rulings and decisions that have curtailed management prerogatives in some significant ways, such as those protecting costly so-called past practices and shielding unit work from competition or consolidation. And it would mean reopening the compulsory binding interest arbitration provision you just extended, this time to impose a tight cap on overall costs of arbitration awards to police and fire unions in all localities without exception, not just those that are already broke. The goal ultimately should be to force more power and accountability down to the local level by giving local officials more of the bargaining leverage they need to restructure labor contracts they can no longer afford. Unfortunately, in lieu of either strengthening the control board and state oversight model or finally giving local officials the tools they need to manage and restructure more effectively on their own, the governor and the legislature seem to have been embracing a vague, irresolute, and inconsistent approach that won't solve fundamental problems and, in fact, is more likely to perpetuate them. A troubling precedent was set in in the last session, actually, when both houses passed measures clearing the way for the issuance of deficit bonds by Rockland County and the city of Long Beach, respectively. In the case of Rockland County, which already has the second highest per capita debt of any county, the legislature authorized additional deficit financing of $96 million. Now, this would equate to roughly 80% of that county's property tax levy, which is the equivalent of allowing New York City, for example, to issue $16 billion in 10-year deficit notes. In the case of Long Beach, the authorized deficit borrowing of $12 million is the equivalent of $12 billion in deficit financing by the state of New York. The only string attached to the Rockland County deficit bond is a requirement that the state comptroller annually review the county executive's budget and pass on recommendations to the legislature, which needs to take account of them. The Long Beach deficit borrowing is completely unconditional, no strings attached, which is completely unprecedented. Both these bills represent a further dilution of the already watered-down approach taken in the Newburgh Fiscal Recovery Act, Chapter 223 of the laws of 2010, which gave that city the ability to issue up to $15 million in deficit bonds without the involvement of a control board. That bill also, I would suggest, was problematic, but Newburgh at least was subject to many more conditions than Rockland County or Long Beach would face if their bills are signed. Newburgh doesn't just have to submit to a controller's annual review of the budget. There are detailed requirements for quarterly financial plan reports and updates and for the issuance of a long-term financial plan in Newburgh. The original Newburgh bill was over 7 pages long. The Rockland County bill is less than 2 pages long. The Long Beach bill is a single page. This, I would suggest, is not progress. This kind of legislation creates an enormous moral hazard. You send a signal to local officials throughout the state in the same way that these repeated spin-ups that Governor Ravitch mentioned earlier have sent a certain signal. And the signal is, when you're up against the wall, we'll let you off the hook. If the governor signs these bills, Rockland County and Long Beach will get to buy time with borrowed money without any assurance that they have taken firm steps to identify and address their problems, or any proof to you that they have done so. And others will be in line, you can be sure, for similar treatment. Now, the Local Government Restructuring Board established by Chapter 67 of the laws of 2013 also falls short of what's needed. Chapter 67 is a passive and voluntary approach, basically all carrot and no stick, seemingly designed to keep problems at bay almost indefinitely without forcing anyone to actually confront them and fix them. I respectfully suggest that Chapter 67 was a misfire, it's not the answer, and the issue needs to be revisited. The buck has to stop somewhere, and it's up to you, and you're looking at this today, it's up to you to decide where. The governor and the legislature need to consider and choose among 3 separate different options than the ones they're looked at earlier. One would be to adopt a strengthened model of state intervention in distressed localities, establishing clear and measurable benchmarks, such as a combination of lower non-existent reserves and mounting out your budget shortfalls. That would trigger the imposition of some sort of control period. And as part of this, you'd expand the power of state control authorities to reshape unaffordable elements of contracts and other spending commitments. Or you could enact the sweeping Taylor law reforms of the sort I cited earlier, which counties and municipal leaders have been calling for over 2 decades. And I would note elected officials in both parties all over the state. And then challenge them to basically put up or shut up. Challenge them to use their new leverage to fix their problems. You asked for it, you got it, is essentially the message. Or one other approach. Take the same approach as California, stand back and allow some counties and municipalities to go bankrupt. This would at least allow some of them to aggregate contracts they could not afford and to reduce possibly some of their debts. As Mr. Brodsky pointed out, in terms of market discipline, bankruptcy has advantages that control boards lack. On the other hand, it's an unpleasant experience for all concerned, not least the people who live in these insolvent communities. I'd like to close with a reform idea that's downright easy by comparison with some of the challenges I've thrown in front of you just over the past few minutes. This fits in with and should be viewed as an absolute prerequisite to any approach or combination of approaches you decide to take to local fiscal distress. And here's what that reform idea consists of. Counties, municipalities, and school districts throughout New York State should be required to produce long-term financial plans, including spending and revenue forecasts covering at least 4 future years. That would include, in other words, next year and 3 years following that. Those plans should be posted online and made readily available in print form to ensure the fullest possible public awareness and engagement in the budgeting process. This is not, repeat, not a costly and daunting new mandate. The tools for this budgeting reform are readily available to those who want to use them. A multi-year planning guide for local government has been developed by the Comptroller's Office, which also offers training to local officials in building long-term plans off of simple spreadsheet templates. Basic guidelines for long-term financial plans have been issued over the years by the Government Finance Officers Association, to which virtually all local budget officials belong. We've got models out there. New York City has provided that with a strong model of long-term financial planning. Other examples have been provided by a handful of New York counties and municipalities, including Nassau, that at the outset were forced to begin developing their own long-term plans as part of financial control situations. To his credit, by the way, Yonkers Mayor Spano has also voluntarily begun issuing 4-year financial plans, which have made clear the extent of his problem and also where it stems from. Now, in fact, this is nothing new. I don't know if you're aware of this. Some, indeed, I suspect most local government and school district officials in schools and localities of any size beyond the tiniest level already do this. They already develop long-term projections as an internal planning and management tool, but they fail to routinely share their projections with the public as part of their annual budget process. Now, in the absence of such information, it's almost impossible to independently evaluate claims by many local governments and school districts that they're approaching their own steep fiscal cliffs, although the available evidence suggests that many indeed are. But think about this for a moment. Here we are today questioning whether some municipalities might not be far from insolvency, and if so, what you might do about it. In the absence of multi-year plans, we literally don't know what we're talking about. We don't know what we're talking about. You hear talk of Syracuse? Where's their long-term plan? I got news for you. It doesn't exist in public. Where's Long Beach's long-term? Where's Rockland's long-term plan? Actually, Rockland's long-term plan is online. Absurdly, the legislature there insisted that it be quote-unquote balanced, and so every year the budget director in Rockland plugs in a property tax, the assumption of a property tax like large enough to fill their yawning out-year gaps. So it's useless. This is not hard, and if any excuse you hear for why this is not done, and I'll be glad to discuss it in a Q&A if you want, is simply will not hold water. It's high time you simply require this. Just not enough localities are doing this and getting on the stick. Now, keep in mind, multi-year plans are not binding commitments. They're guidance documents reflecting where a government is headed if current, reasonably foreseeable trends continue. By showing where and when revenues diverge significantly from expenditure, these plans provide an early warning of potential trouble ahead and give local leaders and the public time to make adjustments. Now, long-term plans won't by themselves solve problems or guarantee better results. They're a tool. By requiring local officials to consider the long-term impacts of short-term decisions, it'll promote more responsible fiscal behavior. Beyond the numbers, it can also provide a vehicle for establishing performance goals and objectives, and for measuring a government's progress in meeting them. So I think that while I raise a lot of tough issues with you and that were implicitly critical of some things you've done, I think in the end, one thing that just about everyone can agree on, and in fact I think most speakers today have agreed on, is the need to begin systematically requiring a systematic preparation and public issuance of multi-year financial plans and to require that they be updated in the manner that they are, for instance, in New York City. With that, I conclude my testimony, and I'd be happy to talk with you. Oh, by the way, I gave you copies of a paper we've done at the Empire Center on long-term plans that has some detailed background in it, in case you have any further questions on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The issue of multi-year planning, real multi-year planning, out 3 years beyond the current year, is a recurring theme. In each of our hearings, it is oftentimes the lowest hanging fruit from the suggestions of things we can do, and I think it obviously makes a lot of sense in terms of contextualizing where we are. Having said that, I think we can all agree that cities like Yonkers, Syracuse, Rochester, and Utica, for a number of other factors beyond long-term planning, are in very difficult straits. There are circumstances, most having to do with legacy costs that they have and decisions that were made, that have placed them and others similarly situated in some rather difficult positions. And the question arises, what is the responsibility of the current generation or the current elected executive or city council or legislature to deal with, and what is the ability of them to deal with these legacy costs and decisions that were made 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago? The way the system is configured today, there is very little, if any, opportunity to renegotiate a decision, a poor decision that was made years ago, leaving the current population with no option but to pay for those bad decisions over and over again. And so I think part of our discussion is, how do we unwind that? How do we allow for some parity that allows for true negotiations in an environment that will only benefit the tax base, as well as, frankly, the long-term viability of that employment base and the stability of our benefit, pension, health care base going forward? Because we have to unravel that. How becomes a whole different issue. And I understand the challenge here, and I appreciate your insight, but that still becomes the issue. How do we unravel it, and how do we allow for renegotiation of issues that have been legacy decisions in many of these cities, including Syracuse, et cetera, for decades?
Well, I think you framed the question very, very well. That is a key issue. I'd like to suggest an answer relating to the largest of those legacy costs. The largest legacy costs in municipalities across New York State, and particularly including the municipalities you mentioned, the upstate cities, for instance. The largest legacy cost is retiree health benefits. In fact, Syracuse, as well as Buffalo, and I'm not sure whether the case is yet true with Rochester, Syracuse in its annual budget now spends more every year on retiree health benefits than it spends on health benefits for active employees. Because retiree health benefits, unlike pension benefits, which are pre-funded through large pools of invested assets in a statewide fund, and essentially are paid for in advance through a savings plan, to simplify it a bit. Retiree health benefits are not paid at the time that the person earns them. They are paid by the next generation when the person collects them. It is done on a so-called pay-go basis. Imagine if you were paying pensions now to retirees straight out of your pocket on a pay-go basis out of annual taxes rather than having the pension fund pay them. That's the way we do retiree health benefits. And again, in a growing number of places, including, I know, Buffalo and Syracuse, the bill for retiree health benefits right now already is higher on an annual pay-go basis than it is for active employees. Now, the collective net present value of what's been promised to employees in those cities is enormous, and it's enormous statewide. In fact, we've done a calculation that statewide in New York, every level of government in New York, states, cities, public authorities, everything that has a public component, the unfunded liability for retiree health obligations comes to $250 billion, according to the official reports of those entities. That's $250 billion of completely unfunded liabilities. The good news is you can begin to unwind those, to a significant extent, those liabilities. Although every year we delay, it will get harder. Here's why and how. First of all, retiree health obligations are not part of and subject to the constitutional prohibition on diminution of retirement benefits that are earned through the pension system. They're not covered by that. They are not untouchable. In many cases, they're not even contractual. They are the product of some past resolution or local law, which can be changed. Even where they are contractual, people who are, there are clear legal precedents indicating that people union members once retired are no longer represented by unions. So how do you begin to unwind these things? Well, one common attribute of retiree health benefits throughout the state is that employers pick up or reimburse the full cost of Medicare Part B premiums for people once they've turned 65. Now, that's a fairly token amount. It comes to about $120 a month, and it's means tested. And the federal government put that small token premium payment into Medicare back in the Lyndon Johnson era as a way to give recipients some skin in the game, to give you some sense that you were contributing to this program. Again, it's a trivial amount, but when you have a large number of retirees, it can add up to a significant amount, even in a relatively small city. I think there's little justification for paying or reimbursing Part B Medicare premiums for people who have higher retirement incomes than the average city resident. Remember, you're talking about people who, if they worked a career in government, have higher retirement incomes than their neighbors and can afford to pay the Part B premium. In any case, you could means test it. Secondly, the principal reason that the cost of retiree health obligations is so expensive is that government employees, by and large, on average, retire early before they're eligible for Medicare. And this is particularly the case with police and firefighters who retire in their 40s and thus spend up to 20 years receiving free or heavily discounted health insurance under not a Cadillac plan, more of a BMW Platinum plan. That's completely paid for by taxpayers after they've retired. And then when they get into Medicare, it becomes a supplement to their Medicare coverage. That's why it's expensive. You can begin now. There's two ways to get at that cost. First of all is to begin to change the nature of the deal that's been promised to current employees and to increase the share that's paid by retirees. Governor Cuomo is doing this subject to legal challenge on the state level. He negotiated an increase in contributions for active state employees and is applying the higher contribution levels to some retirees. Now, it's being challenged in court. But the unraveling process ultimately comes back to one of the issues I mentioned earlier. If you don't give these local officials the flexibility more flexibility under the Taylor Law, including tri-borough repeal and a really hard cap on arbitration that makes it less desirable for unions and makes it more desirable for unions to actually negotiate. Unions are not going to get off the dime and negotiate changes to health benefits. And if they don't negotiate changes to health benefits, you're going to find it hard to negotiate changes to retiree health benefits. In the final analysis, here's what happens when places go insolvent. It's already happening in Stockton, it's happening in Detroit, it's going to happen in Detroit, and it's happening right now in Chicago. What's the first thing to go? The retiree health benefits. Okay, Chicago's throwing its retirees into the new affordable health care exchanges. You will, mark my words, see that in New York sooner or later if localities aren't given the tools to come up with different approaches on their own before then. And there are other approaches, self-funded retiree trusts that were union managed, that could provide retiree health care and insulate them from these problems. But nobody can talk about these things, can talk about doing anything other than taking some benefit from a retired person who's already retired or requiring a person who's already retired to pay more. Nobody can get at these unfunded liabilities unless you get at these Taylor Law provisions I was talking about. That's it, pure and simple. They're not uniform statewide. It's impossible to make a case for the state getting involved in assuming them, although you created another very bad precedent when you assumed the retiree health care obligations of the New York City OTB, I would point out. That was a small amount of money that is putting you at the top of a slippery slope you do not want to fall down. But one final suggestion. The need to unwind these things, as you pointed out, is really important. And find ways of unwinding them is really important. A corollary to a sort of Hippocratic oath approach to government is first, do no harm, or second, don't do any more harm. Bills have been introduced in the legislature each and every year for the past 10 years that would extend a provision already applying to school district employees only and make it impossible to restructure retiree health benefit obligations unless the exact same change is negotiated with unions representing employees. Those types of bills would have the effect of further locking in and locking down legacy costs and making it impossible or very difficult to get out from under them. And those types of proposals simply should no longer be entertained by the legislature because they're untenable. They're not passing, but again, they're put in every year and they are union priorities. So there are paths. The paths differ somewhat by locality to dealing with this. I'd urge you to look at the White Plains case, for instance, which has resulted in some litigation so far won by management, in which White Plains began to restructure its retiree health obligations for some of its uniform unions. It's not always pleasant because it tends to focus on people who are already retired when the focus should actually be on current active employees. It's the reverse of the situation you hear about. You know how when unions negotiate contracts with concessions, the old word is they kill the unborn, so to speak, or they get the newly hired persons. The new hires are the ones who have a lower pay differential or some other deal. The opposite thing tends to happen when it comes to retiree health benefits. It's the old who tend to get stuck when you really need to make the big savings in what you've promised to the people who are still working and who are younger. So it's a long discussion, but I think it's absolutely the right question, and the good news is there are answers to it. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer in all cases, although the Medicare Part B issue is one that should be addressed everywhere, and I think can be done in many cases without negotiation, but by local law.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. EJ has answered my initial question in this last discussion. I just want to apologize. I have to leave. I'm already going to be late for a prior appointment. So I apologize to the following speakers who are coming, no disrespect intended, and I look forward to hearing your testimony at our hearings on the tax reform policy.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in the same boat. I will take the opportunity to read everyone's testimony. I appreciate it very much. EJ, a quick question. What do you think the argument is, and you know it's going to be made whether in court, of retirees who say, look, I took this job, I was offered these potential benefits down the road, and I made a decision as a young person before I went into municipal government as opposed to the private sector. This is what your pay was going to be, this is what your pension was going to be, this is what your health was going to be. And now you're changing the game after the fact. How do you answer that, and how do you think it does in court?
I would answer that, and my pragmatic argument answer to that was, well, your union didn't care enough to ensure that these were financed adequately, so that's your problem, quite frankly. I've been pointing out the issue, and I'm not alone with these costs for years. They've been steadily mounting. They are literally, to use that overused word, unsustainable. They will not be paid in all cases. Repeat, they will not be paid. So anybody who goes into court in a few years from now and says, I'm shocked, what happened? Unions are refusing to deal on this. They're treating it as somebody else's problem. And I think ultimately they're undermining the interest of their own members in doing so. But the lesson is, if it's not pre-financed, it's not necessarily going to be there.
Thank you. Thank you,
Mr. McMahon, as always, thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
I appreciate your testimony.